What's up, Spark Grillers? I'm Tyler, a product development engineer here at Spark, and today we're going to be going over some tips for smoking and slow cooking on the Spark grill with the Spark Low and Slow Briq system. Smoking and slow cooking can seem intimidating for some beginners, but it's honestly way easier than people make it out to be. While you have seconds to pull off your food before it dries out with other types of grilling, slow cooking is way more forgiving and that the food actually gets more tender as it continues to cook. The temperature control of the Spark takes all the hassle out of the barbecuing, so you can practically set it and forget it. First, let's talk about smoke. One of the most important factors to barbecuing meat is the quality of your smoke. Many people think that to properly smoke food, you want to see a constant flow of white smoke coming from the vents. This actually isn't the case, as thick white smoke is a sign of an incomplete burn, which results in bitter, dirtier tasting smoke. It's okay for a little white smoke to appear here and there, but in barbecue, less is truly more, and your goal should be to have a thin stream of light smoke with a bluish hue flowing from the vents. This is a cleaner burning, sweeter tasting smoke, and you'll really notice a difference in those longer cooks. In order to get that smoke to stick to your meat for a distinct smoky flavor, you need the surface of your meat to be wet and rough. Smoke loves water, and adding water to your barbecue is arguably the best way to ensure optimal smoke adhesion. Do this by adding a water pan on top of the grates inside the kettle. The humid environment will keep the surface of the meat hydrated, which allows the smoke to stick to it throughout the cook. You should also slather your meat with water, hot sauce, vinegar, or anything else wet before adding your rub to create a wet and tacky surface for good smoke adhesion. After a few hours of cooking, you can begin to spritz your food every hour or so with a spray bottle of anything wet to keep the food moist. Be sure not to do this too often though, because if you lookin', you ain't cooking. To give the smoke something to grab onto, you want the surface of your meat to be nice and rough. The best way to do this is to add a rub. Not only do rubs help smoke stick, but they are also the best way to customize the flavor of your meat. Even a rub as simple as 1-to-1 mix of salt and pepper can go a long way. Some of our favorite additions to rubs are garlic powder, onion powder, paprika, chili powder, but feel free to experiment. Now for some details on the actual process of slow cooking. When slow cooking and smoking meats, it's important to monitor the internal temperature. For beginners, it's best to use your temperature probes to do so. The key with most barbecue cuts is to bring the internal temperature up to around 200 to 210 degrees Fahrenheit very slowly. If you're cooking at a set point of 250 degrees, it generally takes about 1 to 1.5 hours per pound to reach an internal temperature of 205 degrees. When you cook low and slow, the meat actually gets more tender as the internal temperature of the meat rises due to the melting of collagen and fat. The magic of slow cooking is that you can turn some of the toughest, least desirable cuts of meat into melt in your mouth tender awesomeness by simply turning the heat down for a long period of time. Before smoking or slow cooking anything, do some research online to see what internal temperature is recommended. Though pork shoulder, brisket, and ribs are cooked to 200 to 210 degrees, a whole chicken is still generally cooked to 165. Since every piece of meat is different, you'll also want to check if your meat is probe tender before you pull it off in conjunction with checking the internal temperature. Probe tender is when you can take a probe or a fork and gently insert it into the meat with little resistance. If it feels like the probe can easily slide in, then you're ready to pull the meat off the grill. But if it doesn't quite feel tender enough, keep it on for another 30 minutes or so and check again until you have it just right. If you're smoking one of the classic barbecue cuts, like pulled pork, brisket, or ribs, up to an internal temperature of 200 to 210 degrees, you'll experience what is known as a stall. As you're cooking, you'll see the internal temperature of the meat gradually climb until it reaches about 150 to 170 degrees. It's at this point that the temperature in the meat will flatline and will seem to stay there forever due to a process known as evaporative cooling. A lot of people make the mistake of pulling the meat off at this point thinking it's done, but be patient. You still have a long way to go. Many barbecue masters will recommend you wrap your meat in aluminum foil or butcher paper at this point. The purpose of the wrap is to preserve moisture in the meat and to speed up the cooking process a little bit. I personally like to wrap my meat about 30 minutes into the stall. To do this, simply wrap the meat up in foil or butcher paper as you would a present and put it back on the grates. Once you wrap the meat, you aren't going to absorb any more smoke flavor, so you can technically put it in the oven if the Briq's towards the end of its life. If I'm doing something like a 14-pound brisket, I will usually smoke it on the Spark for 6 to 8 hours and then throw it in the oven after I wrap it, since the Briq is designed to last 6 to 8 hours. I also get the added benefit of making my house smell like smoking meat. However, with something smaller like pork ribs, you can complete the entirety of the cook on your spark. For these ribs, it'll take about 2 to 2.5 hours to get to the stall. After you have spent a good chunk of your day smoking or slow cooking a great piece of meat, the last thing you want to do is cut into the meat prematurely. You need to let it rest. This step is not to be skipped, no matter how hungry you or your crowd may be. The rest is a critical step where the moisture that has seeped out of the meat towards the edges slowly starts to reabsorb and evenly distribute throughout the meat, restoring its juiciness. If you cut into a piece of meat straight off the cooker, you'll lose all those juices and your meat will dry out in seconds. Don't throw away a day's hard work. Ribs should be rested for about 30 minutes, and larger roasts like pork shoulder and brisket should be rested for about 1 to 2 hours depending on the size. You can always rest for longer if needed, but make sure that the internal temperature of the meat stays above 145 degrees Fahrenheit for safety. I hope this video has been helpful to get you started on your journey to becoming a Spark pitmaster. If you have any questions or are looking for more recommendations for recipes, rubs, and smoke profiles, contact Spark customer service and we'll be happy to take care of you. Have fun and happy cooking.